spent the last few days just looking at the timing of this moment. Like, who would have thought that when the invitation came forward to speak, that the world would be where it is? I'm in the US and there's all sorts of tension in the US right now, but this message of hope, this message of resilience, the whole meaning of the phoenix is really resonating with me. So I'm excited to have, this time with everyone. It's going to be 9 p.m. In the US when this starts. So I'm going to need people to comment or, give me feedback because it's a whole different 12 hours over here. To the participants that are on the chat, can you say something? Maybe put in a one if you can, if you're happy to be here. I'm pretty sure you can see and hear me. But I just want to test out the chat feature. Would you be so kind as to put a one in the chat just to let me know you're here? Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Hi, Karen. Good morning or good evening on my end. Philip, I'm so glad that you can hear and see me. Um, I am happy to start exactly at 9, or if we want to wait and give people some time, I'm happy to do that. Just let me know when you'd like me to start sharing my screen, and I'll pull my presentation up and we'll get started. To all the wonderful people that came exactly at 9 a.m., good morning or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. I just people joining us, so I don't want them to miss anything unnecessarily. So Philip or Clive or any of the Phoenix team, would you just let me know in the chat if you'd like me to start, and I will go from there. I feel like I should have background music. Do you guys want background music while we wait? You'll wake up. I am going to play some background music. It's too quiet. Mhm. I've just been listening to news though, so my background music will probably be boring if I just play the news, but that's all I've been listening to lately. All right, guys who are on the Zoom chat, welcome. People who are in the room, welcome. I'm going to start at around 9:05, just to give everyone time to get into the room. I see people are still coming in. At that time, I'll go ahead and start my presentation, but I tell you what, I will um, share my screen and go from there. Okay, I'm going to start in 1 minute. I'm getting excited. Oh, let's see. Try and start my tablet so I can see your comments because apparently I can't share my screen and see your comments. All right. I'm going to get started. Thank you guys for waiting. Well, good morning, good evening. We are um, ready to start. I am Dr. Keisha Sarabois, and it is my distinct pleasure to be the first speaker at the very first Rise at Home event for the Phoenix Foundation. So to the 22 participants that are joining us, welcome. I am delighted to start off this outstanding event of happiness and people getting involved, and I'm excited about the origami that's happening after this. But I'm going to talk to you about storytelling. And I'm going to talk to you from the angle of you can do hard things. Just to let you know where this wonderful moment is going to take us, I'm going to talk about how to talk about hard things with young children. And I'm going to start with this premise. So let me introduce myself, my background. Oh, there we go. And since I'm sharing my screen, I hope you all don't see exactly what I'm seeing. Let me see if I can clean this up, because if you're seeing all of this extra stuff, that'll get in the way. 1 second, guys. Let me adjust that and then move this. There we go. Hopefully that's better. So my experience and my background is deeply rooted in literacy. I am very passionate about early childhood literacy range of child development, just fascinating to me. I am speaking to you from the United States. I'm currently in Ohio. My background experience, I just did education and my credentials. As I shared uh, uh, in comparative education. And then I did my bachelor's, I started at home and I did that in cultural studies and family science. So all of my education has really put me on a path to think about families and think about diversity and then compare education systems. And now at the doctorate level, really zone in on literacy and the importance of literacy within the family in the sense of English language education. So this is my favorite little stormtrooper. This little guy is here to let you all know that I welcome you to participate in the conversation and the dialogue. You're going to see some opportunities for you to participate. So here's what you can expect. So there's a presentation where I'll go into a little bit of the research, really give some useful feedback on how you can talk about hard things through storybooks with young children. I'll share some book recommendations, and here is my absolute favorite part. I have set time aside for Q&A. This is absolutely a moment of community, and so I'm a responsible timekeeper. I am starting my timer, so I make absolutely sure that I leave time for Q&A because I want to hear from you. So if at any time, anything that I say, you have a question about it, or if there are parents that are on this call and you want to go further into this, you're more than welcome to either put a question in the chat, or you can use your video function and ask me directly. And I also have book recommendations. So if it turns out that we don't have too many talkative people or there's not a lot of Q&A, I'll use that time as well to share book suggestions. All right, with that, let's get started. So the Phoenix Foundation, when I started looking into, what would I speak about? I love the whole concept of the phoenix. As a bird, it's a mythical creature. And one of the things that really stood out to me about the phoenix is that it is a creature that was fabled to be immortal, which means it never died. But the way in which its life cycle evolved was very interesting. Each time a phoenix would sort of, as they would say, die because they're immortal, they would basically turn into ash. And then from those ashes, it would regenerate and hatch a new phoenix or be reborn. So basically, it recycled its life. So on the left, I have this gorgeous image of this full grown phoenix, and it's this beautiful mythical creature, and you see all the fiery flames. It's, they say that it had this flame like the colors of the phoenix. If you remember the Harry Potter phoenix, it had these vivid orange and fire-like colors. So in this graphic, you see this amazing creature. But then on the right, I show you the rebirth moment. In order for a phoenix to be reborn, it must die. And from the ashes, and the way it dies, it turns into ash. And from the ashes, a new phoenix is reborn, or, comes forth. And boy, what a moment of rebirth, in the sense of when I think about where we are in the world. If I look at the United States, if I look at Hong Kong, if we look at the world in general, we are all in a place of rebirth. And I say that because COVID-19, in the span, if you start back in December and you think back to now, in that short time frame, our whole world shifted. And what we understood about life, like the moment where we were this big, bright, fiery phoenix, if you think of, the metaphor I just used, we went from this moment of being a full-grown phoenix to suddenly having our ways of life turned into ash. And now, as a world, we are all in various stages of rebirth. In Hong Kong, for example, secondary students have gone back to school. Primary and younger students, they're still trying to decide how to approach that. Here in the United States, schools are closed, and now, we've eased into summer, and we're still trying to figure out what will reopening look like. And as we think about that little baby phoenix I showed you in the previous slide, we're all at this young age of trying to figure out how are we going to grow into this new reality and eventually rise above it. And as we consider that, we have the added experience of all the things that have happened. Protests are occurring. As we think about the ash, the things that we're trying to find our new life in the States, we are dealing with civil unrest and protests around the murders of African Americans at the hands of police. And then, of course, we also saw the murder of Ahmaud Arbery due to, issues that we are still trying to understand why. And then in other parts of the world, protests and civil unrest is continuing to occur. And if you're not in a part of the world where you're dealing with protests, you are all dealing with the whole idea of what is education going to look like. In this bottom corner of the screen of another Zoom meeting, in some states or in some parts of the world, they're actually holding preschool classes online. So there's all of these new things happening at once. So you have education trying to decide, what are we going to look like? How are we going to reimagine classroom? What is school going to look like? We have protests occurring, and all of these things are sort of happening. And here is, again, that young phoenix trying to rise or growing in this. But as someone who is firmly rooted in education, my mind really goes to, what are the actual children making of this? Because when we look at it from the adult perspective, we have enough on our minds just trying to figure out how to adapt. But how do you explain this to a child or a young child specifically who is making sense of the world in real time? They don't have, like, you and I could think back to our childhood. We can think back 5, 6, for some of us 10, 20 years ago and understand what the world was. But for a child who is 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, their understanding of the world is still shaping. And so as they're watching all these things unfold in front of them, the changing of their former understanding of school, the introduction of what new school is going to look like, people and the fear around COVID, or unfortunately, the large amount of lives that we have lost due to COVID, or they also are exposed to the protests. There's protests happening, as I shared. How do we help them make sense of what they're seeing? How do we have these hard concepts, things we as adults are still trying to figure out? Well, I am glad you asked. If you're interested in understanding the answer, that's what we're going to talk about today, or begin to discuss what are some ways we can approach this. And I call this section Rising from the Ashes, because one thing I enjoy and I strongly agree with is the kind of resilience, and old enough to remember history, and I've studied enough to understand that whatever acts from them, and we will soar, will once again grow into a beautiful phoenix. But how do we get there? And what does that mean? of early childhood. How do we talk about hard things with young children? And when I think about, shared this, we have no idea to a classroom or what that may even look like. We know social distancing is something that's going to happen all over the world. So how do we help them adjust to this change? A few months ago, they had a chair right next to Julia. Now there's going to be a chair in the middle and maybe two chairs before you get to the next person. And so as we start to put in distance, how do we make sure that children don't feel isolated or that they understand what is happening? The good news I want to share is that during the early childhood stages, young children and their brains are unbelievably flexible, and they have the ability to adapt and adjust, and they show resilience at such impressive rates that even in the midst of all the difficult things that we're talking about, I want to share with you that young children are able to not only handle hard things, but they're wired to adapt quickly if they're in loving environments, if they're in a safe place, if they know they have adults that are around them that care for them and they feel safe. Young children can thrive. And like we think about Phoenix and who is the young baby and who is rising from the ashes, young children have the ability to burn from the ashes and fly. But once we get them in a routine and they understand that they're loved and that no matter what, everything will be okay, they are amazingly resilient. So I want to share that with you. And I have this slide in front of you because it's one of my favorites from the Center of the on the Developing Child from Harvard University. And it just shows you how a child's brain is amazingly adaptable in that first year of life. But if you look at those higher cognitive functioning skills, which is where we're going, and a lot of the skills that we're going to be talking about, you have a wide amount of years where their higher cognitive functioning abilities are malleable and operating at some of its highest capacities. And you don't see it start to decrease until we get around 12, 13. So when we look at the primary years and the early childhood years, this is when children's brains are indeed the strongest for change and resilience and a lot of the things we're going to talk about. So I want to also share that the information I'm going to share right now is largely targeted to parents or people who imagine that they're going to be future moms, future dads, future aunts, uncles, or if you are, I am an aunt. And I find that a lot of the things I'm going to share with you are not only grounded in the research, they're extremely helpful when you think about how are we going to do these hard conversations. And the very first thing I want you to understand is that children's reactions to stressful events may vary. So the great thing is that no one child, there's no one thing that you can count on as the end all be all. Like, I know my child is stressed because they're crying, or I know my child is stressed because they're not eating as much. Stress can look very different. And I want to just dispel the idea that stress can only look one way. Okay? And if you want me to go into more details, just let me know, and I'm more than happy to do that. Now, one thing that makes stress interesting when we think about stress within young children, how well it's life that it's very natural that life is going to happen and stress will occur. That's a part of life. And as long as children experience stress, but then they experience comfort or they experience love, they're able to just take it in stride as that's a part of growing up. But when we have moments of excessive stress, like normal stress is I want to play with a toy and I can't play with that toy. or I want to stay up, but I have to go to bed, or I want to spend more time with mom or dad, but I have to go to class, or I have to do something that takes me away from that. That's normal stress. It's a small thing. It's the inconvenience of growing up. And like I said, there's still the opportunity to come back home or wake up in the morning and receive all the love of family. So the child takes that as a part of growing up. But when we get into moments of excessive stress, like what we've seen with the pandemic, where all of a sudden a child was going to school and then suddenly they weren't, or a child was looking forward to graduation and then suddenly it's snatched from them. Well, how well their executive functioning skills are developed and how strong the adults around them can handle excessive stress starts to play a much bigger role in how this child's development plays out. And in early childhood, it's extremely important that we're paying attention to this because we will see lifelong repercussions if a child is exposed to excessive stress and there's no love or there's no mitigating factors to decrease the risk and the harm of the stress. But the great news is that it's very easy to address these things. And I'm going to share with you some of the most useful things you can do to mitigate those concerns. And I also want to take time out to share that for adults who are listening, if you find yourself feeling very stressed out in these moments and you wonder why it's so difficult for you to calm back down, or if it's harder for you to sleep, or you're just experiencing some excessive stress or some things that aren't your usual, or things that you really didn't deal with, say 6 months ago or a year ago, I want to gently share with you that you may have experienced some difficult things in your childhood that weren't necessarily addressed. And now, as an adult, you're having similar stressful triggers that are making you revert back to your early childhood experiences of how you learned how to deal with excessive stress as a young person is absolutely how you will have to unlearn how to deal with stress as an adult. But it's far harder for you to do that as an adult. So that's why I find early childhood so fascinating, because it's that foundational phase of brain development. By the age of 5, 90% of a child's brain is developed. And so, what that means in those first 5 years, the things that they're learning, the ways in which they're processing things, plays a massive role in the adult that they grow into. And if you want to go further into that, you're more than welcome to ask me questions. I find this area fascinating and I could talk for days, but I won't. I'm going to move on, I promise. Okay, the slide wouldn't let me. Now it's moving. So what can we do to mitigate these issues in early childhood? Or how can we as adults, as parents, as caring adults, be there to support children in these moments, particularly when so many things are changing or so many things are happening around them? Well, one of the first and most important things you can do as an action, create moments where you can be a sensitive and responsive caregiver. Now, what does that mean? So, for the adults who are here and you're like, wait a minute, my life is crazy enough. I'm doing this, I'm doing that. I'm not asking you to be a superhero. In fact, I celebrate every person that has gotten through this moment. And you're even on this call because you're taking time out to continue the things and make time for the things you love to do. I support that. What I want to suggest and share with you is that these moments where you create a sensitive and responsive space for a child, you can create a 15-minute moment of reading aloud. You can hit a lot of the main things you need to do can be simply done through reading with a child. And I'll show you what that looks like. So in this moment, you see an adult, maybe it's the father, maybe it's the uncle, we don't know. And we see an early childhood child. The proximity of the child being in the adult's arms is a sense of comfort. Not, they know that you're there for them in those moments. And if you're doing, say, like I mentioned, 15 minutes or more of this routinely and consistently, then you are putting up a defensive shield around this child that lets them not only have a space where they know they're loved, it also creates a space where you can start to have conversations. And that's when the type of book that you're using becomes that bridge that can allow you to start conversations with your child about some of the things they may be seeing and how to talk about those things in age appropriate ways. And that brings us naturally to the third thing, which is provide age appropriate information. Now, I can speak from this very personally within the United States. Unfortunately, the murder of a man by the name of George Floyd was captured on video, and it was circulated online, and it's all over the news. Now, when I talk about age appropriate information, I understand that we live in a highly digital world, and you have screens and TV and a lot of things that make it almost impossible to protect or prevent things from reaching your child, particularly with the ability to have cell phones. Like, we just don't know when something may pop up, particularly when we talk about our children in upper primary, our 8, 9, 10-year-olds, because they're a little tech savvy at that point, particularly. But when I talk about providing age appropriate information, that's when, excuse me, that's when it becomes particularly important that if you're reading aloud with children, that you're picking up books that allow you to have these conversations, and that if you don't have professional advice or you don't have resources that can walk you through how to have these sort of difficult conversations in an age appropriate way, I am very delighted to share that with you as we continue the presentation. But there are plenty of resources that can help and guide you in what age appropriate information will be. And I can give you an example. On this screen, I have listed out some of my absolute favorite books that are wonderful for talking about difficult things. If you see in the center, there's a book called The Rabbit Listened. That story is wonderful when talking about hard things. The premise of the story is about a child who's building a castle out of wooden blocks, and then all of a sudden, birds come and knock it down. And then all of these different animals come forward and try to tell the child what to do. And the child just sort of curls up into a ball and doesn't really want to talk to anyone. And eventually the other animals walk away or leave in a bit of a huff until a rabbit comes. And then the rabbit just sits beside the child and listens. Doesn't say anything, doesn't force anything to happen. They simply sit beside the child and let them know that someone is there, that supports them, that they're comforted, that they're loved. And then eventually the child opens up and starts to share the things that are on their mind. And I think that's such a beautiful example of what care looks like from an adult, or what appropriate comfort can look like. Just being there with the child and waiting on them to share all the things that are swirling around their mind. Not so much forcing them to say what we want to hear, not so much sort of directing them into the areas we want them to focus on, but just acknowledging and respecting the young mind that they have and giving them room to give voice to the things that they're thinking about. And then waiting for a moment where you can share your feedback on what they shared. And when you do it in that manner, you are supporting the child's individuality and saying, you have a voice and I hear you and I honor that because I listened to you before I responded. But you also encourage the child to speak with you more from their heart. And there's several great books on this list. Another one is Sam and Dave Dig a Hole. And that's a great story about resilience. And the story is very, very simple. In fact, it's almost deceptively simple, about two men that go outside and decide to dig a hole until they find something spectacular. But as they're digging, they start to get tired and they feel like nothing's happening. And so they stop and they change directions. But as you go through the book, you begin to realize that if they would have just dug a little bit deeper, they would have found a big diamond. Or if they would have dug a little bit deeper when they go in a different direction, they would have found an even bigger diamond. But it shows what happens that sometimes when we give up, we're right at the edge of something magnificent, or we're right at the edge of a breakthrough. And that's a message, even as an adult, I find such hope in, because even as our country, our world goes through this space of confusion and uncertainty, I believe that we're right at a moment of resilience. We're at that moment where we're going to grow into a massive phoenix and spread our wings in triumph because we've come through a hard thing. The last tip that I'm going to leave you with is practicing the 3 R's, which is reassurance, which is something I shared with you and how I describe how you can comfort a child. But another example of reassurance isn't so much saying, oh, everything's gonna be fine, we're gonna go back to normal, things will be the way they were, because we don't know that. And I'm not advocating that you reassure a child with things you don't know to be true yourself, but there are certain things you know will never change. You will always be there to love that child. That child will always have a safe home within your family. There will always be family members that care about them. And for those of you who may have experienced the unfortunate passing of a loved one during this COVID moment, the reassurance is that you had time with that person before they passed. And if you allow yourself to be reassured by knowing that in the life that they lived, that you were loved, that they gave you whatever wisdom they could, and that whatever they taught you, it has helped make you a better person, or whatever they were able to instill in your life is wisdom that has helped you reach a goal that they may not have been. So when I talk about reassurance, I want us to think about the deeper things that never change, not so much the surface things we can't control. The other are routines. I have talked at length about the beauty of reading aloud, and I mentioned 15 minutes. I invite you to engage in reading aloud with the child at least 15 minutes every day. It will do wonders. And if you want to know more about that, I have a TED Talk where I go into great detail. Routines also add a buffer of protection and support around young children. They find comfort and solace in routines. So even if the routine is that at a certain time we go to bed, we brush our teeth, whatever your routine is, if it's we have dinner, then we take a shower or we take a bath, then we brush our teeth, then we, read our book, or we have our nighttime conversation, and then we go to bed. There is so much reassurance in a child's routine that they not only feel comforted by it, but it feels like a sense of normalcy, because it's something that they can rely on. And also, as your children age, it's something they can show maturity in, as to where I know what I have to do, or I can brush my own teeth. It's how they start to assert their independence. Or if you're reading aloud with the child, this is when you'll really start to see them grow in their independence or want to grow in their skill set, because they'll want to take on more of an active role in the reading or in the turning of pages or in showing you what they've learned. It's such an amazing thing. I can get lost in it because it's the thing I love. And so if you want to hear more, just ask me questions. And the last one is regulation. And that actually expounds to mean self-regulation or emotional regulation. And that's a higher order skill of teaching a child how to regulate, self-regulate difficult emotions or when they're starting to feel overwhelmed. This is where you hear practices such as yoga, breathing, mindfulness, thinking about the whole child, social emotional wellness, social emotional education. This is what regulation is really talking about. So when we think about the 3 R's that we really want to practice to support children. Hello? Okay. When we think about the 3 R's that we really want to use to practice to support children, we want to remember that it's reassurance, routines, and regulation. I have so much information on this that I'm more than happy to share with you. I know that 30 minutes may not have been a great amount of time, and some of you may have more questions that you want to discuss, or some of you may want to consider working with me or talking to me one-on-one. I am pleased to announce that I have launched a website and a whole literacy consultant business to support parents in this time. And because my heart is really in supporting parents, I have put free resources on my Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter feeds at Dr. Keisha Cares. I've shared a free resource with you by the Hope Project. It's called Hope, Where Are You? It is a children's book, a free children's book that is available in over 40 languages. If you go to my Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram page, it's the last post or it's the latest post, so you can't miss it. And I've shared all the information there. You can download that book and begin reading with your child or sharing this story with your child. And the beauty of Hope, Where Are You? It's a story that looks at how 6 children from all around the world are dealing with sheltering in place, school closures, and the impact of COVID-19. And this is a story that you can share with children between the ages of 3 all the way up into 12, because there are concepts within the story that apply to every child in the primary. And I would even wager that you could extend that to children in secondary and have an even deeper conversation about how they've been handling the shift in the shift in what they understood to be normal. And if you want to go into further understanding of some of the things I talked about on my website at Dr. Keisha Cares, I have shared links to my TEDx talk that talks about the importance of why we should read aloud, but I've also shared my keynote that I did in February of this year. And that's about an hour of information where I go deeper into how do we protect our children from trauma, how do we teach self-regulation. So I have laid a wealth of free resources at your feet. And if you want to work with me one-on-one, I have provided my services at extremely discounted rates because of the importance of this moment. So all of that information is on the website or on my social media feeds. Now we're at my favorite part. I can stop doing a screen share and get into book recommendations and comments on the books or any of the things that you may have had. So I am no longer sharing my screen. I think I am now here. You could see me. So my first question in the chats, does anyone have questions? Are there any things that people may want to speak about in length or questions that may have come up? If you have questions, you're welcome to raise your hand or say something in the comments. If you raise your hand, cut your camera on and we can have a conversation in this moment. If not, you're more than welcome to say something in the chat and I'll answer your questions that way. In the meantime, while you may be thinking of your questions, if you want to talk, or if you decide that you're still waking up and you don't really have any questions, that's okay too. I will share a few book recommendations with you in this time, because of course the whole point of this talk was to talk about storytelling. And I was told that, I had an hour to really go into this. So I wanted to make this time as beneficial as possible. I didn't just want to, put a storybook in your face and say, here's how you read a story, because that is a great skill. But I also wanted to gift you the knowledge of why it's so important to read this story, or what this children's book is really a way to mitigate stress, build a healthy child, help strengthen brain development. That's what the power of storytelling is. But the whole talk was about, well, how do we talk about hard things with children? I want to share several titles you can use to talk about difficult things with children in age-appropriate ways. The first book I want to share with you is Everett Anderson's Goodbye. This book is one of the few books I've come across that deal with the topic of death. And that's a very heavy thing for a child to understand. But in the COVID-19 epidemic or pandemic, we saw a lot of people die very suddenly, very unexpectedly. And some children may be going back to schools where people in the school aren't there anymore, or people that they saw in the community aren't there anymore. And it doesn't matter where you are in the world, these were things that impacted people. And so this is a great story to just talk about how death can be processed by a child. And what I love about the story is that it shares, the story is written to talk about the 5 stages of grief. And denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then acceptance. And so in this story, you have a child who's lost their father. And the author walks you through the 5 stages of grief until finally the child reaches the place of acceptance, where they understand that while they may no longer physically be here, my love for them will continue to live on, and I am going to stand firmly in believing their love for me is something I carry as I grow. And so this is an award-winning book that, talks about death in a way that is meant to discuss with a young child. Another great story I wanted to recommend is called Drawn Together. This book is exceptional. And the one reason why I love this book, and I have not seen too many books that do this. I have to open it up because this one is so cool. So what you have in Drawn Together, and I'm gonna try and make sure you can see the full book. Let me change this angle so I can make sure I'm showing you. There we are. So I see what you're seeing. So what you have in this book is the generational divide. You have a grandchild or a great-grandchild that speaks English, and you have a grandparent or a great-grandparent. I believe he speaks Vietnamese. Yes, I still know my symbols. He speaks Vietnamese. And you have a culture gap or a communication gap, right? But what this book does so beautifully is show through a few words, but mostly pictures, how communication can still occur. Look at the beauty of these photos. look how vividly you start to see a story. And some of you may be looking at this and you can relate to these moments. This picture alone says so much, right? But then look what the author does here. So, what's new, Grandpa? And then the grandpa responds in Vietnamese. And then they begin to realize that they're not able to communicate verbally. And then they sit down to watch TV. And what the grandfather thinks the grandson may be interested in, he's not. And so you start to see two people that want to relate but can't. The grandson says, "Can we watch something else?" The grandfather doesn't understand. The grandson doesn't feel like he's communicating. So there they are watching TV, but the distance between them is growing. And then the magic of this story really starts to take off. Look at what happens. And what the author does, the author and the illustrator do so brilliantly, is that you see a story unfolding with no words. And what I love about storybooks like this is that for children who are in multilingual, bilingual, trilingual homes, this is where you can explore all of those beautiful languages within the context of one story. You can begin to narrate the story in whatever language you want. The child is invited to narrate or talk about what they're seeing or what they think is happening. And here's where things start to get interesting. So the grandson, since he's not able to follow the TV show, gets up and starts to draw a picture. And the grandfather gets excited because he realizes, wait a minute, I draw as well. And then it says, right when I gave up on talking, my grandfather surprised me by revealing a world beyond words. You ready? You ready? I don't know if you're ready for this. I can't see your faces. I'm not really seeing too many comments. If you want me to turn the page, put a 1 in the comments so I know that you're actually here, because you might have left and gotten breakfast. I don't know. Maybe I'm the only one geeking out about this book. So if you're still here and you're enjoying this, put a 1 in the comments and I will show you the next page. No ones? Oh, there's a 1. Okay, so a few people love it. Well, if you love it, then that's enough for me. Get ready, because this is when the book takes off. Watch! Look at this! I can't hide my excitement. I told you I geek out on books. It's why I got a doctorate degree. I love this. Look at the detail to traditional Vietnamese style in art. And look how they respect the child's creativity. But look at what you have here. You have tradition and history and family values being supported by the next generation, the innovation, the creativity, but they're both there together. And so the grandfather and the grandson begin to create their own world. How amazing is this? And you begin to see the blend between young and old. And for my friends who are in Hong Kong and you've seen some divisions happen between young and old in the protests, to my people who are dealing with this in America, as we see divisions between racial lines, it's so beautiful to see a story that reminds us of how we can find our common ground and find ways to connect together. And so the story continues to unfold, and I don't want to ruin the story by telling you everything, but there is a moment where, of course, you have to have your character of opposition. You have to have your protagonist just as you have to have your antagonist. And the beautiful thing is that, okay, since you love it, I'll show you. I have to show you that one page. How can I not when you've already told me you loved it? So Phoebe, this one's for you. And Karen, this one's for you. So they're having a great time and they're spending all this wonderful time creating their world. But then all of a sudden, that old distance arises between them. And you don't have to put this in the comments, but we can all think about moments where that old distance separates one generation from another. And some of us are dealing with that distance now. I know in the US, we're dealing with that old distance on racial lines. And we're dealing with that old distance as people and police or people of different, socioeconomic statuses are trying to figure out how can we ever bridge that old distance. Because no matter how pure our intentions, no matter what we want to happen, sometimes that old distance just comes up and it comes roaring back to keep us separated. But that's why I really enjoy being a part of the Phoenix Foundation, because we believe in rebirth from the ashes. And together, they fight against that divide. They fight against that old distance. And you know what's so great about this is that they all fight in their different, unique ways. The creative child who was in color, he starts to fight the way his grandfather fought. So now he's in black and white. And if you notice, the grandfather who was in black and white, he takes what he has learned from his grandson, and now he's fighting in color. How awesome is this story? Like, oh, I can hug the authors and the illustrator, because what a powerful message to share with the child. And so when I talk about the power of storytelling, when I share the power of reading aloud, this is what I mean. Like all of the things I taught you or I shared with you all in the beginning, this is why reading aloud is such a powerful thing. It's why I spent 4 years researching this, because I'm amazed at what a story can do for brain development. I see a couple of faces. Are there some questions? I don't have any raised hands. So, okay, if you do have a question or you do want to talk to me, you're always welcome to say something. I have about 15 more minutes and it's all here for you guys. And I have plenty of books. So don't be shy. Feel free to ask questions. So this was one of my books. Are you ready for the next one? Are you ready for the next one? Okay, I got all this energy and it's almost 10 o'clock at night. But I get so excited when I start talking about books, because it just, when I think about what a book can do for a family or a parent-child bond, or how it can mitigate stress that a child is feeling, there's nothing better. And what we know about memories that occur during reading aloud, you carry it for life. You carry it for life. Like you get no better return on 15 minutes than reading aloud with a child. All right, next book, next book, next book. Oh, it's hard to pick. I have 3 that I want to share. I'm gonna share this one next. This is a story that you can use to talk about difficult things, such as grandparents who may be dealing with Alzheimer's or who may be experiencing memory loss. Alzheimer's is a really difficult thing to see happen to a loved one, because you slowly watch their memory fade. And you find a grandchild or a child may wonder why the grandparent or the great-grandparent doesn't remember certain things that they do, or that they keep forgetting the child's name. This is a great story for addressing that. And the way they talk about the impact of Alzheimer's is through balloons. Look at this brilliance. So each balloon in the story represents a memory. And it starts off by saying, now the book is called The Remember Balloons, okay? Oh, is there a question? Oh, there is a question. Wait, I'll pause because I have a question, and your questions are important. Ricky, the first book about bereavement is sad. How to have dialogue after the storytelling? Oh, great question. So the first book after. So Ricky, do me a favor. Are you talking about this book? Or are you talking about this book? Because you mentioned sad. So, or maybe you just want to know, how do we have a conversation after storytelling? I absolutely suggest that you can have a dialogue during storytelling if the child has a question. Depending on the age of the child, they may have questions that they want you to answer right now, or they may have comments that lead to a conversation. Don't be afraid to lean into that. It's perfectly okay if it takes you several nights to finish a story. Say, you're reading this story and questions and conversation starts, and the child brings up memories of when they went to a grandparent's home and they wanted hot dogs, but they ended up eating some dish, or they had something else. And you start talking about that, and you may turn that into a conversation. And you may look up and it's bedtime, because children are very clever. They will use these moments to keep talking so that they run up the clock and they can stay up a little longer. But again, we stick with our routines. Remember our routines, our 3 R's: reassurance, routine, regulation. And the routine is, if we go to bed by 9 o'clock and it gets to be 8:59 and we're only on this page, well, guess what? We have this to look forward to tomorrow. But I think someone else mentioned, oh, that is a really big link. My kids love reading, but love playing iPad and phone games more. So difficult to control. Yes, it can be. But that's where we have the use of digital books, ebooks. And if you're a parent that's like, when I'm reading with my kids, we may read at bedtime and I don't like them to have screens. That's perfectly okay. What I do in those situations, if you have a child that's very active or you don't feel like they're paying attention, I ask them to help me read the story. And one of the easiest and fun ways to do it, have them make the sound effects, okay? So since this is the book I'm holding, when my kids, these were my kids and they were busy playing with their phones or things like that, I would ask them, I need a sound for eating food. So when I point to this, I either need you to make the sound where you're slurping, or you're making the sound of chopsticks yourself, or you found the sound effects and you can start the sound effects on your phone when I get to this picture. Now, yes, they're still playing on their phone, but they have to follow the story, okay? And you can make this a negotiation of some sort, in the sense of, it's fine if you have your iPad or your iPhone during story time, if you're going to use it to add value to the story. You're giving me sound effects, or you're, finding out information. Well, you don't want them to find out information,
because you still need them to follow the storyline. But if you have them be your audio team and they're coming up with the sounds, then they can use their phone to find the sound effects. But let them know that if they take too long with finding the sound effects, you'll prefer that they use their own imagination and create sounds. So in the beginning, it's a choice. Here's the TV. You can make the sound, or you can make the blah, 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 blah. I literally just made a sound because I don't speak Vietnamese. So my sound effect of this moment was blah, 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 blah. But if they were on their phone and they were doing this, maybe they could have played a sound on YouTube where they're actually playing a snippet of something in Vietnamese, or they found an old Vietnamese TV show and they play a clip of that during that moment. But if you're going through the story and you realize, they're not following along, then you can say, all right, I gave you several tips to follow this story using your phone. I want you to try using your imagination, because I want to see what you can do now that you've used the phone. I challenge you to come up with some sounds. And it's also fun when you do it as well. So it doesn't feel like all the attention's on me. It becomes something we do together. So, the child came through and they had their little snippet. And then here, when it's time to read the stories, you can use a different child voice for the son or the grandson. And here you can use a different voice to show the older grandparent. And it doesn't matter if you don't speak Vietnamese. Like, you literally just saw me say blah, 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 blah. So you could be silly and say something too. But when you create this sort of atmosphere, you become a game.